In this video, we're going to look at Revelation chapters 12 through 14 as a unit together. The purpose here is to walk through each of these chapters sort of at a somewhat of a flyover approach, but making some comments about what is contained within those chapters, and then going to each chapter itself to understand the flow and arc of this section of Revelation. So, what you will be doing is sort of reading and then pausing and unpausing the video as you consecutively read through Revelation. My purpose here is not to get into the nitty gritty details of many of the debates that are in this chapter, or this section. The chapters of this section contain some of the sort of most weighted portions of Revelation. We have things like the different beasts, the mark of the beast, the 144,000. So we have all of these symbols that throughout the history of interpretation, there's been all kinds of different takes on each one individually. We're not going to go through each one of those, but we're going to try and see if we can take a sort of literary step back. And as we walk through these chapters, we can see sort of where they're going and what they are doing. So we're going to start by having a pause and you reading all of Revelation 12 through 16. So this is past what we will do in this video, but these are the focus chapters for this week. So what I want you to do is start by getting yourself oriented to what's going on in these four chapter 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, these five chapters here, and then I will come in and we'll go through 12, 13, and 14 together. All right, now that you are back after probably, 15 minutes or so of reading these chapters, let's jump into what these chapters are doing sort of as a unit. So I view Revelation's chapters 12 through 14 really as sort of an independent unit. That is not to say they're not connected to and don't have connections with what came before in Revelation and what comes after Revelation. We will see that there are connections there, but we really do have sort of a shift at Revelation chapter 12 that does something different and unique that Revelation sort of hasn't done to this point in the book or in the apocalypse. And that thing is really showing how evil is working behind the scenes. It's working sort of at these Revelation chapter 12 through 14 is really showing how evil has already been defeated and exposed in heaven and sort of sent down on to earth. And this does a number of different things with respect to the sort of thrust of Revelation as a whole, is it exposes the limited power of evil, that evil per Revelation, especially chapter 12, has already been defeated, and its defeat on earth is ultimately inevitable as well. But in the meantime, while it still has not been defeated on earth, we see these calls for endurance that have been repeated throughout Revelation. We saw them in the letters to the churches. We've seen them elsewhere in Revelation. We see them again. And this really sort of provides a picture and a reason why Christians ought to endure in the face of the evil that has been sent onto earth. And then ultimately Revelation 12 through 14, and then into 15 and 16, where we get the pouring out of those different bolts of wrath, ensure divine vengeance against the evil that is portrayed as first in heaven and then on earth in Revelation chapters 12, 13, and 14. So let's start out with what's going on in Revelation 12. This is where we have this sort of re-mythologized version of what is often referred to as the myth of Apollo and Python. So John is taking a myth that exists in several different forms. So Leto is Apollo's mother, and Apollo is sort of pursued by this great dragon or snake, depending on which version of the myth one looks at or reads, and ultimately kills this great dragon or snake. And this myth sort of gets recast in different kinds of ways by Greek by the Greeks and the Romans, and ultimately by Greek and Roman authority figures as sort of this symbol of victory over evil, of light over darkness, the gods over evil. And John recasts this in a different kind of way. So he takes sort of something that is culturally familiar, mythologically familiar, and puts it into sort of his own Jewish Christian terms, wherein the different figures or different characters in the myth refer to different figures or characters that are more theologically proximate or more theologically relevant to John's Christian audience. So one of the things I want us to note in this entire section of Revelation is that the symbols that are used here do have specific reference, but at the same time, John is not so concerned with saying this equals this, this equals this, this equals this. That one symbol can sort of have multiple, or one character can have multiple reference for John. And that's the case in Revelation 12, and that's the case sort of in the other chapters that we're dealing with here as well. So, for example, the woman, I don't think we necessarily need to identify her with one single symbolic figure or as having one single referent. Rather, the woman in Revelation chapter 12 seems to have characteristics of Mary, the mother of Jesus, of Eve, of Israel, and the Messiah's mother, who would also be, of course, Mary. And then the son is the Messiah figure. The dragon is called both the devil and Satan. We're also told he has these sort of angelic underlings. We have sort of a recall of the fallen angels tradition alluded to in Revelation chapter 12. And then what ultimately happens is that in heaven, Michael and his angels defeat the dragon, or the devil and Satan and his angels, and they are then sent to earth, so that the conflict is finished in heaven and then sent down to earth. And as we said earlier, this is sort of a confirmation that the victory over evil, the victory over the dragon, the devil and Satan and his angels, is already accomplished in heaven, but then the sort of story moves it on to earth. And so what I want you to do is sort of, having gone through this here, let's go back to Revelation chapter 12, pause the video here, and read through Revelation chapter 12 a little bit slower, thinking about some of these features that we just talked about. All right, so then we move into Revelation chapter 13, and we have a couple new bestial figures that are introduced. So having been sent from heaven to earth, the heavenly dragon looks for bestial assistance. And what we see here is sort of this connection between cosmic evil in the form of the devil and Satan, moving into more sort of imperial evil. And once again, we see that that John seems to have some reference in mind with these characters and these figures, but they're not necessarily limited to those reference and those characters. And I think this is one of the things that both the reading from Bosack and the Gonzaleses do well on this, is that they emphasize the ways in which what's going on here is symbolic and mythological, and it can be sort of reinterpreted in different imperial situations in different times, even if John is living within a particular empire and maybe has the Roman Empire and certain Roman emperors in mind when he writes these things, but he doesn't necessarily limit himself to the symbol being only about that particular emperor or only about the Roman Empire. And I think this comes out when we get the presentation of the first beast, which alludes to Daniel chapter 7. And Daniel chapter 7 explains that these different beasts are a result of different empires. And so Revelation 13 sort of alludes back to, intertextually alludes back to Daniel chapter 7, ensuring us that we have sort of a political entity here, but it's reframed. It's not four different beasts as in Daniel chapter 7, but it's one beast that has sort of characteristics of all of these different empires. So in this way, we have specific empires, but we also have empire, generally speaking. Within that first beast, we also have this reference to the death blow. And when you go to your commentaries, you'll see that there is much made, usually, about this death blow and specifically connecting it with Nero. So there seems to be already emerging with the first beast, and it's going to come out again with the second beast, a connection to the Roman Emperor Nero. And then in the second half of Revelation chapter 13, we get a reference to a different beast. So the first beast comes from the sea. There's also connections with the sort of chaos monster Leviathan, which is prominent in the Old Testament and sort of in Jewish history and understandings of evil. And then paired with the beast from the sea is the other beast from the earth, which seems to probably reference Behemoth. And the idea is that it's sort of the ultimately good will overcome these two sort of evil chaos monsters. And so John seems to be evoking both of these in Revelation chapter 13. And we'll move on to saying ultimately that they will be overcome and defeated as Revelation progresses. But it's with the second beast that we get sort of more of an emphasis on worship, that worship seems to come out further. And it seems to be that what's going on here is that if the first bestial figure, namely the dragon, not the first beast, but the dragon that gets thrown down from heaven, refers to evil cosmic powers of Satan and the devil, and the first beast seems to refer to the Roman Empire writ large, the next beast, beast number 2, seems to be about sort of the worship of the beast, and specifically worship of emperors and the empire, so that we sort of have this subset of the beasts who get authority from different in sort of this chain of command. That at the top of the chain of command is the dragon, who represents cosmic evil, the devil, Satan, who then empowers the Roman Empire, who then empowers this practice of Roman emperor worship, which is in contrast to, and which is idolatrous in view of the worship of God and the worship of Jesus. So, sort of seeing this flow of bestial power, go ahead and pause here and revisit Revelation 13 and see if you can see that sort of flow come out in a little bit slower reading of this chapter. All right, and on to our last chapter in our reading together. In Revelation chapter 14, we have a sharp contrast with what we've seen in Revelation chapter 13. So with chapter 13, we have the dragon, the first beast, and then the second beast. And then we sort of get this immediate shift to the Lamb on Mount Zion, a very different kind of creature than the beasts that have been presented in Revelation chapter 13. And we have the worship of the 144,000. So this harkens back to the 144,000 that we're worshiping back in Revelation chapter 7. So you can think of Revelation really as doing this kind of circular thing where as it moves forward, throughout the apocalypse, it also circles back to ideas and images that were presented previously, and that's what's going on here. And the contrast continues in Revelation chapter 14 insofar as the 144,000 have non-bestial names written on their forehead, namely the name of the Father and the Lamb is written on those who worship the Father and the Lamb, and that's in contrast to the number 666, the name of the beast, which is written on those who are sort of worshiping and committed to the beast rather than the Lamb. So we have this contrast of the kinds of worship. The worship on earth that's of the Roman emperors and is associated with the Roman Empire versus the worship in heaven of the Lamb. And then following this, so we have this contrast, following this, and implicit in it is the promotion of the right kind of worship, is the message of these three different angels. The first is to worship God, so it's this sort of call to make the right decision about which entity, which creature or animal one worships, whether it be the beasts or the Lamb. And then the next message is Babylon is fallen. So we have this idea we've talked about previously in the class that Babylon equals Rome. Ultimately, these beasts are going to fall. That for this reason, it is not a good idea to worship them. And as Babylon falls, there's impending justice, or there's justice that sort of is divinely initiated, which results in the fall of Babylon, but also results in sort of justice and wrath being poured out in Revelation upon those who are not on the right side of worship here. And then as Revelation 14 progresses into chapters 15 and 16, we have these bowls of wrath poured out wherein the justice is depicted. So again, it's this flow of presenting the different options of what one worships, and then sort of causing one to make a choice, and also encouraging that same message of endurance that we've seen throughout Revelation because of what is ultimately the result of not worshiping properly, the outpouring of justice and wrath depicted in Revelation 14 and then on into 15 and 16. So I want you to finish up here by going to Revelation chapter 14 and seeing this contrast between the worship of the beasts that we saw in Revelation chapter 13 to this sudden shift to the worship of the Lamb in chapter 14, then moving into the outpouring of these bowls of wrath in Revelation chapters 15 and 16.